Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing an updated video series on the OPNSense Firewall. Now I haven't done videos on the OPNSense Firewall in a pretty long time, so I'm really looking forward to getting back into it, seeing what updates have happened since my last series of videos, and I'm really anxious to help show the community how you can secure both your home and your small business networks. So let's get started. Okay everyone, so here we are on our OPNSense Firewall. Go ahead and log in as root. Now you should really change this username and disable the root account for security reasons, but for the purposes of this video, I'm using the root account. Now this video is just going to be a general overview of OPNSense and what it can do for you. I'm going to make some more topic-specific videos here in the future, but for right now in this video, we're just going to go over the OPNSense Firewall as a whole. So when we log in, immediately we're taken to the dashboard. Now this is a live firewall, and on the Protectly FW4B, I do have thermal sensors. Now this does have 4 cores, and the nice thing is I can see the temperature of each one of my cores and also my zone 0 sensor. Now that's important because this is a passively cooled unit. It doesn't have any fans. It just has a large heat sink on top of the box itself. I'll put a picture of what the firewall looks like up on the screen for you so you can understand what I'm talking about. So here on the dashboard, we have the thermal sensors. We have our system information. This is going to be our host name, the version of OPNSense and FreeBSD that it's based on, also the version of OpenSSL. We can check for updates. That's also in the system firmware section. We can see our CPU. This unit has a J3160 Celeron CPU with 4 cores and 4 threads. We can see our average loads, uptime, current date and time, all that kind of stuff, and our storage information. The nice thing I like about OPNSense over here on the right is we have all of our services showing up and their status, and we can stop and restart services individually over here. For example, we can see that we have cron running, DHCP, our routing service. We are using the Squid web proxy here and the web GUI and so on and so forth. Next, we have our gateways. So this unit has 4 interfaces, but right now we're only using the first 2. So we have our WAN gateway, which is pulling an address via DHCP, and we have our LAN interface. Now the FW4B has 4 network interfaces, but we're only using 2. We're using the WAN interface and the LAN interface. And we can also add widgets here. So if we go up here to the top, we can add widgets. Now if we're using CARP, we can put CPU usage in there, interface, all these different things. If we're running OpenVPN, we can have a traffic graph in here. In fact, I like to have a traffic graph in there, so I'm going to add that. And the traffic graph shows up here. But I may want the traffic graph to show up above. Let's say I want it above the services. So I'm just going to left click and drag it up there. And then when I save my settings, it's going to now show this traffic graph up here. And lastly, we have columns over here. So we can choose how many columns we want. This is going to increase the amount of time it takes to load, obviously. I'm just going to leave it on 2, but if you want to pack more information onto the screen, you can increase the number of columns. It looks like up to 6. Next, we have our password. Now, one of the first things you're going to want to do when you set up your firewall is change your password. Default password is OPNSense, all lowercase, all one word. So you want to change that in here, and you can also select your language. Next, let's take a quick look at the reporting area. And we've got several different areas within the reporting. We can go to health. So here we are under health. And we've got 3 different tabs. We've got packets, system, and traffic. If we click these drop-down arrows, we can select individual items. Okay. And we can also select a granularity between 1 minute and 24 hours. We can show inverse, and we can show tables. And the tables just give us additional information in addition to the graph. So let's just go over to traffic. And if we select WAN for our traffic, this is a chart of our WAN traffic. And we can see the legend here, what's what. Very useful information. Next, we can go to Insight. And when we go under Insight, we don't have local data collection enabled. If we had NetFlow configured, we would be able to get information there. Now, anything additional that you enable is going to put more load on the firewall. So you have to think about whether or not the performance cost is going to be worth that information and insight that you're going to get. Now, if you want to get the insight, you can enable NetFlow. We have an advanced mode here. And if you're new to the OPNSense Firewall, it's probably a good idea to enable this full help. This just shows you all the information underneath of each of the selections that you can make so that you can make the most informed choice possible. So if you want to enable this, I'm not going to enable it, but you have your listening interfaces, your WAN interfaces, and the rest of this. You hit apply and that will enable it and it'll start collecting data. Next, we have our settings. So under settings, we have the RRD settings. This is for our graphs. This is where we get the information collection for our graphs. Now, if you're using the unbound DNS and you want to enable reporting for that, you can select this option here. I'm going to say save and enable that because I am using it. And you'll know that the changes have been applied because you'll see this message here at the top. And here at the bottom, we can select what reports we want to collect. Right now, these are all the defaults. But if for some reason you don't want to collect information on some of these items, you can remove them. Next, we have traffic. And this is kind of similar to the widget that I showed you in the beginning. But we have our graphs, and then we have our top talkers. And this is going to show us the top talkers on our network and what interface they're talking on. Next, we have our unbound DNS. And we just enabled this, so we're not going to have a whole lot of data in here. But this is where we're going to get all of the data from our DNS server. And it'll show us our client activity, and we can change the interval that we look at. Right now, it's showing us 24 hours. We can see if anything's been blocked. And right now, we're not doing any blocking, so the size of our block list is 0. And we can see the total number of queries. Now, obviously, I just enabled it, so it's only showing 156 queries. Next, we can go to System. This is where we're going to do a lot of our system configuration. And the first thing we want to look at is access. And the first area we want to go into is users. Now, by default, you have this root user, which is a system administrator. Now, because everybody knows the root user is the highest privileged user on any system, you always want to add your own administrative user. And this is where you would do that. And you would add them into the admins group. And then what you want to do is log in as that user. Make sure you can successfully log in. And make sure you are an admin and that you can access all of the administrative features. And then once you're confirming that, typically I would go in and disable the root user so that they cannot log in. I'm not going to do that here in this video. You can also go in here and set up groups. Now, the only group we have here is admins, which is for system administrators, but you can set up as many groups as you'd like in here. Next, we have servers. So right now we have the local database. This is how we do our authentication. But if you wanted to authenticate from another source, such as LDAP, you can set that up in here. Next, we have tester. Now, this is going to allow us to run authentication tests. So we don't necessarily have to log in as that user, log out and log in as that user to test it. This is especially useful if you're using a different authentication server, such as an LDAP server. If a user contacts you and says, I can't log in. Or if you just recently created a user and you want to make sure that they're able to log in, you can test that here. Next, we have configuration. And the first item we have here is the backups. Now, I always recommend that you do backups. You can enable backups to Google Drive, which I think is an awesome feature. So you can do that here. One of the first things I do before I ever make any change to the firewall is download the existing configuration that I know works. That way, if anything goes wrong with my configuration changes, I can easily get back to where I was before and either try again or choose to put it off until a better time. We can also do a restore from here. And by default, it wants to reboot after a successful restore, which I think is a good idea. Next, we have defaults. Now, this is going to allow us to fully reset the firewall to its default settings. We're not going to do that. Next, we have history. Now, this history is a really nice feature. This allows us to come in here and see what changes to the configuration were made. So if we're running into an issue and we have multiple administrators on a firewall, we can come back here and see who made the change. Next, we have firmware. And under firmware, this is where we're going to manage the firmware on the system. And we can check for updates. In our settings, we can select our mirror, whether we want to use development packages. Don't recommend that. We have our change logs. If we go under updates, this is going to show us all the packages that need updating. Here under plugins, we have all the plugins on our system. We can also add additional plugins as well. And lastly, we have packages. You can see a lot of different packages available here. And we can reinstall them from here. We can view the license and that kind of thing. We have a reporter. This is where we can report issues with the OPNSense system. And then lastly, we have a log file. This is going to be the firmware log file. Next, we have gateways. Now, we have two gateways, but we only have one LAN connection. We're just seeing the IPv6 and the IPv4 here. But if you have more WAN connections, for example, you'll see a bunch of different options in here. You can also set different gateways for different traffic and so on and so forth. You can create gateway groups. These gateway groups can be used in your firewall rules. And it gives you a little description of what those do here. And we have our gateway log files. Next, we have high availability. Now, if you're looking for high availability, you can use something called CARP, and that'll allow you to link multiple firewalls together. So if you have a failure on one firewall, the other firewall can take over and provide some fault tolerance. So a lot of really nice features here in the OPNSense Firewall. Next, we have our routes, status of our routes, and a log file again. Then we have settings. And if we go into settings, we can go into administration. This is going to give us all our admin options. For example, we have our web GUI options in here, as well as SSH. Now, by default, SSH is not enabled. And so if you want to enable that and you prefer to do things via SSH, you can come in here and enable that. And we have our console and our authentication options in here as well. We can also, down here at the bottom, select our deployment type. This is a production deployment, so we have production selected. Next, we have cron. This is where we're going to be able to come in and see all of our cron jobs that we have set up. And under general, this is going to be the general configuration of the system, our host name, time zone, language, theme, etc., etc. We have our DNS servers. We also have something cool. If we have multiple gateways, we have gateway switching. And so if one gateway fails, it will automatically switch to another available gateway. So again, another cool feature that's going to provide some fault tolerance. If you have one WAN connection that fails and you want to fail over, that's a good option to have. Logging. This is where we're going to configure what we want to log and for how long we want to log it. By default, it's 31 days. That's how long it keeps the logs. Next, we have logging targets. And we can go in here and we can send the logs somewhere else. If we don't want them to be stored on the firewall, we can send them to a logging server. And under miscellaneous, this is where we're going to have things like hardware acceleration. If you have a cryptography accelerator, you can select that in here. This is where we actually enable the thermal sensors. Those were not enabled by default. So we can see the temperature of our CPU, periodic backups, power savings, and some other things in here as well. And then lastly, under settings, we have the tunables. And under tunables, this is where we can do some more advanced configuration. Next, we have trust. This is where we're going to configure trust authorities, certificates. So this is going to be the initial configuration wizard. If for some reason you want to run that again after you set up the system, you can go and do that here. Now, next we have log files, and this is going to be pretty much self-explanatory. You have all your different logs here, like your boot log, for example. You want to come in there and look at your boot log. And we have diagnostics. Next, we have our interfaces. Now, again, we only have our LAN and our WAN interface set up here, but obviously you have a ton of options here in your interfaces section. So we can see all the options set up for our LAN and our WAN interfaces. And if we go into assignments, you can see that I actually have 2 additional interfaces in this system, and I can assign those here. And the overview section gives us an overview of our interfaces. We can configure virtual IPs. Wireless, if you have wireless set up on your firewall, I really don't recommend that you combine the firewall and wireless. You're better off having a separate wireless access point and just letting the firewall be a firewall. That's my opinion. Point-to-point, other types. For example, we have VLANs here and diagnostics again. And we can do all kind of things under the interfaces diagnostic section. For example, we can do DNS lookups, pings, trace routes, all that kind of fun stuff. Next, we can get into the firewall section. Aliases. Of course, aliases are very useful because you can use one alias to define several different hosts. And then when you create firewall rules, you only have to reference that alias. And so if you want to change the hosts, or if the host IP address changes, all you have to do is change the alias and it updates all those firewall rules. So aliases are a very, very useful feature. Categories, groups, your NAT, your one-to-one NAT, your port forwarding, and that kind of stuff will be set up in here. The rules I was just talking about, you can set up all the rules for your different interfaces. Now, by default on the LAN, it's going to allow traffic to go anywhere. And if you remove those rules, you will not be able to get out. And the WAN will not allow any traffic to come in or any traffic to pass inward, which is what you want in most cases. We have a traffic shaper. Here we can get in and configure the traffic shaper. Settings. So we have some advanced firewall settings. And like the other sections, we have our log files and our diagnostics. Next, we have VPN. And we can do IPsec or OpenVPN. And we can also run a server here as well. So if you want to allow clients to connect to your firewall, or if you want to connect to your firewall, if this is a home network, and you want to use VPN when you're away from your home office, you can do that here. You can also create secure VPN connections to other firewalls in other locations, which is useful. Next, we have services. And this is going to depend on what options you have installed on the firewall. As you can see, we have several different options here configured. We have a web proxy, our unbound DNS, OpenDNS, which we don't have configured, our NTP, intrusion detection, another DNS service here. And we have DHCP. So if you're using the firewall to give out DHCP, you have that here. And captive portal, which we'll be doing a video on later. And lastly, at the bottom here, we have power. This is where we can reboot the firewall or power it off. And then we have our documentation. So as you can see, folks, the OPNSense Firewall is a very powerful system. I'm going to be doing a lot of very topic-specific videos here in the future. If there's something you'd like to see specifically, let us know down in the comments section. As always, folks, remember to like, subscribe, hit that bell so you get notified anytime we add new content, and thank you guys so much for watching.